Welcome. I'm Crystal Cotto Sullivan, your host of Journey to Inner or Practical Wisdom. Why practical? How else do we acquire wisdom but from the practical engagement of our lives on all levels, physical, spiritual, psychic, soulful, and emotional levels? As I told you in our last book club podcast, we're going to be talking about books that we've discovered in our book club. So today, Jillian, Joanne, and I will talk about a book by Simone Heng. Let's Talk About Loneliness. She wrote it in 2023, and it was published by Hay House. Heng states in her introduction that she speaks about things that are felt universally. Loneliness in the midst of unprecedented digital connectivity, the legacy of loneliness caused by an isolating pandemic, and the effects of childhood trauma on how we connect with others. So let's begin our conversation.
Hi,
Great.
Joanne. Hi,
Welcome.
Crystal.
All right, I'm going to unmute. There she is. There's Joanne. Fantastic. Okay, so let's talk about the book. Here's the book for those of you who are actually watching. There's the book. And she published it after COVID. So I don't remember who suggested this book. Which of us suggested it?
I did, actually. My husband saw it on his reading list and he said, "Oh, here's a book you might be interested in." And so that's how it came about.
Well, and I think we agreed to it because we've all, well, we as well as many people had very different experiences during COVID. And we know we may not have been lonely. I was lucky because I live in a household of 3 people. My grandchildren were able to come and stay with me. So I didn't experience loneliness so much, but I know a lot of people who really did experience loneliness during COVID. And, you know, even people who died by themselves, like imagine no one could come and be with them when they were dying. So I think we all thought that it was a very timely conversation. And what I recall when we had our book club was that we talked about loneliness, but we really spent a lot of time talking about connections.
We did.
Yeah. So what do we want to say about this book?
Well, you're talking about COVID there. Like I know people who were very extroverted before COVID, but after COVID, they became very introverted, and it was very difficult for them to get out. Like I know even for myself, who is very comfortable with my own company, I had to make the effort to get out and join a group. And that's when I joined the networking group for the first time. And that's where I met both you ladies. So that really helped. And after that, it was okay. Like I've made a lot of new friends since then. So made those connections, made the effort.
Did you hear that?
Yes.
Okay. I have a plumber downstairs.
No, I didn't hear that.
I didn't
you
hear
can't.
either.
Oh, okay,
No.
good. Okay, good. Sorry. Okay, then let's get back on track. If you didn't hear that, yay for my computer. Okay, so Jillian, that's a good point about how COVID actually changed how we interact. You know, we became a little bit more isolated, and she talks about that in the book that and when we become isolated, what happens is then we become a little bit anxious. We become more anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And then if we're more anxious, it's harder then to go out and to connect. So it's almost like a vicious cycle. And then the other thing that can happen, and there's some research on this that she quotes from the Virginia Affective Neuroscience Laboratory, that the more isolated we are, we become socially awkward. And I experienced that. Even though I didn't feel lonely in my house, once I started to go out again, I felt awkward. Like, what do I do in this situation? And
Mhm.
so it's really taken me some time to become comfortable again. And, I feel like, like I haven't left the farm.
Yeah, I remember, when you would meet people, when you were allowed to go out again, there was a period of time during COVID where we could safely go back out there. And you'd meet somebody and you'd want to hug them. And you
Yeah.
couldn't. And you wondered, okay, they must think I'm really awful.
And the other thing that she says is that we misread social cues. So the social cues that we were comfortable with prior to COVID, all of a sudden, what do? We can't shake hands. We can't give a hug. We've got a mask on, so we can't even read the social cues, the facial cues. So really, we've gone through a period of separateness that it's almost like we have to relearn how to be connected, how to be
Mhm.
connected.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
I'd like to comment on that part about the the masks. When I was reviewing my notes this afternoon, the part about unmasked, and that there are several facial expressions that are absolutely universal that you can communicate with, but these were covered up, as you said, by the masks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found myself looking at people's eyes, trying to read what their eyes were saying, whether they looked happy, scared, sad, what. But then the other revelation that I had was, what about in regular time, the masks that people wear,
Mhm.
Yes.
and how to people have learned in certain situations to just hold the poker face or the nothing face. I
Mm-hmm.
call it the model face, where they walk on stage and they go, and they're kind of out into the distance.
Mm-hmm.
They look like you don't know who they are. You're supposed to focus on their clothes. So they're intentionally taught, I think, to show no facial expression. It's the mask of the model. And I wondered, now that we're back out there, have we learned something about how to read other people?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I don't have the answer to it, but I thought the masks, they were cloth or paper, but we still have them to some
It's in,
extent.
it's interesting though, like talking about the mask, and we are talking about loneliness too. Like I have a hearing loss, as you know. I read lips. Now, can you imagine what that was like for me? Like I
Yeah.
had
Oh,
no idea
yes.
what people were saying. And also, I remember one time I was in Walmart, and a girlfriend walked up to me who I did a lot of stuff with during COVID, but she had a mask on in the store. I didn't know who she was. She had
Wow.
to tell me who she was,
Wow.
you
Wow.
know. So it was, yeah, so it was really difficult. And I know when I went to the hospital, and they wanted to call your name, I hadn't a clue. And then, you get into the room and they're doing these tests and they're giving you instructions. I hadn't a clue,
Wow.
what they were saying. So it was difficult. I mean, even in the best of times, loneliness comes up with a hearing loss. When I'm in a room, like one time, at Link, I was in a room and I didn't hear anything all night. I could hear the people beside me, but people across who were, telling something about what they did, I didn't hear anything all evening, and yeah, it's very lonely. So
Mm-hmm.
that's my experience of loneliness.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Wow.
Hmm.
Well, I think, just talking about an experience of loneliness, I think the my probably most intense experience of loneliness was when in my early 20s, just married, well, we'd been married a year, we went to Africa. And at that time, it took 6 weeks for a letter. There was no internet, there was no texting, and the telephone line hardly worked. So I couldn't phone home. I would get a letter from my dad. My dad was a great letter writer, and once the letters started to come, I would get letters. But I was so lonely. I was so lonely, And, even now when I think of, oh, what if we were to go to Africa now? That lonely is stuck in my bones. Like I can still feel that level of loneliness. Now, it was great to be there. I loved being there. So don't get me wrong, but there was just that experience of loneliness that was just felt so deep inside of me. Lucky for me, I made some great friends and great connections. So that really, and my parents came to visit us and my sister. So it was fantastic. But that's like a really intense feeling, that loneliness, when you just feel so isolated. And yeah, and to be in a room with people and then to feel lonely, like that's even more intense. One of the things that I took out of the book, she talks about connection, and I think that because we so focused on connection, I just want to read that she talks about 5 types of connections. And I think it's really important to think about those when we're making connections, and to make sure that we have connections at all of those levels. Like the first one is micro connections. It's the you walk into a store and you greet someone and you smile at someone. The difference between walking into a store and someone smiling and someone ignoring you, for me, is huge. And just being helpful for someone if somebody needs a little bit of help. So those short moments of connection she talks about. Then self-connection. And when we talk about Cassandra Speaks, she talks more about this. That's our next podcast. But being in touch with our own worthiness and our own wholeness. And it has to do with our own emotional intelligence. And then the next 3 are really what she talks about in terms of 3 orbits of connection. And those are really like our world. So the intimate connections, people that we can be vulnerable with. And it's really, we talk about vulnerability, the people who love us. And for some people, that's a romantic connection. For some people, it's their best friends, where we have deep friendships, the people that we just click with. And then there are the relational connections, like extended family, the people who help us out when we need them. Somebody you can call and say, oh my gosh, I need some help, and boom, they're there. My husband has this great group of hockey players that he used to play with. And he just has to give them a call and they're there to help him. It's a wonderful relational connection. And then finally, there's the collective connection. And those where we feel that we belong, or affiliations that we have. And that would be like any hobbies or interests. So like collective connection would be this book club for me. Also my art class, and, where the gym, or, going to Aquafit, all of those types of things. So I think that it's really important to think of those 5 levels of connection, to be sure that we're nurturing all of them and not just focusing maybe out there. We have to focus on ourselves as well, be connected to ourselves. And then just the way that we encounter the world every day in those micro connections.
Well, I know when you talk about vulnerability, it says in the book, it holds the key to human connection, the vulnerability. But there's a risk involved with being vulnerable, because the person you were with, they could use that against you. I mean, you could be friends with somebody today and be vulnerable and share with them. And if something happens with that friendship, and they might use that against you. So there's a great risk, or your risk might not bear fruit, that you share something with them and they go, oh well, and so there's a great risk involved with that, I think.
Absolutely, there's a great risk, but what's the option? You could live in a cave. Right?
Yeah, that's true, but I guess it's a matter of learning who you can really trust and who you can share with. I had other experience where I've been vulnerable, and it's allowed that other person to be vulnerable right back. And that was the only time they would be vulnerable, is if I did it first. So that was interesting. So I think vulnerability is so necessary. It is difficult and it's risky.
Oh, it is. But I mean, when you take the lead, it means that you're braver.
Hmm. I think we have to remember that.
That's right.
And
That's
I
right.
think the question is, do we want to live a deep and rich life, or are we content to live on the surface?
Hmm.
So that risk factor is a little bit like the trust level. And sometimes it takes a while to be with a person and to pick up on how they communicate to know whether or not you can build trust with them. And this may seem odd, but when I'm listening to a person, if I hear them telling me things about other people that are none of my business, that's an immediate stop. We're not probably building any further, because what that tells me is that there is no appreciation of confidence.
Hmm.
And so you have to learn to assess kind of how people operate. And I think it's here in the book where it says this concept of oversharing information before the trust level has been built. And because if you hear a person telling about everyone else, anything that's told to them will probably be broadcast. So decide where they are. And it may take a little while, and you might get burnt a couple of times, but you know what? That's okay. Because I love the part in the book about go deep, not wide with relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And if a person has, it said here, 5 close
Yes.
friends. And I'm saying in this day and age, if you are fortunate enough to have 2 or 3 good friends that you can share from the soul with, then you are very blessed.
Yeah.
But they don't happen by accident. They need to be nurtured, the seeds planted, they need to be nurtured, cared for, and reciprocal.
Mm-hmm.
And then they will flourish. And chances are it doesn't have to be someone you see every week. There's these connections made.
That's right.
So that you may not see the person in person for 2-3 months, and then you pick up just where you left off or somewhere else. It doesn't need any excuses of, oh, I haven't seen you and all that kind of thing. They pick up, and it's really beautiful to see.
She uses the term also nomad connections, and I can really relate to that because sometimes we have connections that go back years and we don't see people for years. So just at the end of September, we had a reunion of people who taught in Africa with us.
Oh,
And
wow.
one of the couples, we hadn't seen them, I guess we might have seen them about 35 years ago. And just like that, the connection was made. And we were together for a weekend. And another person that came, we did see her last year. But prior to that, it was probably 15 years since we had seen her. And then on the phone, and then we Zoomed with some other people as well. And we hadn't seen one couple, again, 35 years, another couple a year. And it was like no time had passed. No time had
Wow.
passed. It was wonderful. It was such a wonderful connection. But I love those kinds of friendships. We have a number of those where you may not see the person for months or maybe even years, and there's that connection. I love those relationships. I just cherish them. They're so
Yeah, I think it's interesting that people will do whatever they need to do to have a connection, to have a friend. Sometimes some of the things they do are not good because they want to belong somewhere, right? Like I'm
yeah.
thinking
Yeah.
off the top of my head, like gangs or cliques. And in school, they want to be part of the cool kids. So in order to make that connection, they have to act in a certain way or be a certain way. And so that tells you how important connection is,
That's right.
that need to belong to a group.
Good point. Good point.
And that's the big fear when you with social media and the younger people who have not yet established their identity and aren't confident in who they are. And so their biggest fear and causes them no end of anxiety is this idea that they might be booted out of the tribe, and they really want to be part of the tribe because, you know, the parents and family are taking less prominence for them because they're trying to build their own identity. And during the pandemic, you could really see that. And since the pandemic, if you watch on social media, the things that kids will do to get noticed, it's become, you know, it's just become a real phenomenon that so that they aren't extricated or kicked out of the tribe, and they need to belong.
Yeah. 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 Well, and it's interesting you say that, Joanne, because our natural instinct as human beings is to be connected, isn't it? I mean, as soon as a baby is born, it wants to be connected to the mother. And you want to that baby to attach to the parents. So the scent, the touch, all of that is so important. And then, you know, as we grow, we have less connection, but that connection needs to be built right from when we're born, and it's just so essential. And you know, again, I think to the pandemic, and I think of people who were isolated and there was no touch. And one of the things that is also she talks about in the book is how important touch is. And then during the pandemic, like we had to be 6 feet apart. Well, how do you touch anybody 6 feet apart? Like even just, you know, patting someone on the shoulder or whatever it is, couldn't do that. Yeah.
I remember going to visit my mother in her nursing home during the pandemic. This when we were finally allowed in. We had to sit 10 feet apart. My mother was almost deaf, and her eyesight, she could have been declared legally blind. So she's sitting over there with her mask on, and we're sitting across the room, it felt like, with our masks on, and we are literally yelling at her. And she wasn't picking up hardly any of it. And I'm going, this is bizarre.
Yeah.
So bizarre. Like,
yeah.
Just almost impossible to communicate. It was exhausting.
I'm sure.
Exhausting.
Yeah. Because you can't use your normal ways of communicating, and you're trying to figure out how do we connect? The other thing I wanted to say about touch that she talks about in the book is that from a neurological perspective, touch helps us to feel safe. So again, thinking about babies, you know, they're held, we hold kids' hands. So when we're touched, we feel safe, we feel cared for. And when we're not, we feel stressed. And what happens when we're stressed? Then we're open to disease. And so it's just like a domino effect in terms of when we are lonely, when we are not touched, when we are isolated. So I think that it's I liked the book. A lot of the book is her story as well. She talks a lot about her story. And but she does make some really important points about loneliness and particularly about connectedness, as we kind of shifted to talk more of that when we got together. So any last words about
last word here. This at the end of it, the statement was made, your human connections are your legacy. And I've done a lot of thinking and writing about legacy. And that's really interesting to think about, that the human connections are your legacy. And one of my dear elderly friends passed on in April, and she was the epitome of connection. And as I wrote in my journal, when she passed, she had the unique ability to make you feel seen and heard and accepted. And I'm going, wow, now that is something to emulate.
Yeah. That's great. Okay, well, let me say thank you to all of you who are listening to us or watching us. I hope you have something to take away today. Even if you don't pick up the book, I hope there was some tidbit that makes you think about connections, about loneliness. And stay tuned for our next podcast when we unpack The Fossil Hunter and Cassandra Speaks. See you next time.